My name is Jeff Lane, and I want to welcome everybody to Lane Motor Museum. My story really starts before me. It kind of starts with my dad, because he was the first person that had the passion for cars in our family, although my grandfather had a passion for cars. But he was in the Army in 1954, 1955, and he was stationed in Germany. He actually ran one of the printing presses that made coupons for rations in Europe. And he bought a new MGTF in 1954 when he was there. He actually wanted to buy a Jaguar, but he couldn't afford it because he was a private in the Army, so he bought an MGTF. He was only in the Army for 2 years, and then he moved back to Elmont, Michigan, which is north of Detroit, about 30 miles, which is basically where he grew up. And he brought the TF back with him. And within a couple of years, he got married to my mom. They started to have a family. And he realized very quickly that living in a northern climate and with a family, that a two-seater sports car with no heater was extremely unpractical. And so the TF went. He sold his TF, and which he always missed. And then in about 1967, so this would have been about 10 years later, 11 years later, he kind of got the bug to buy another TF. And so he started looking around southern Michigan, looking for a TF. And he was able to find a car. He bought it. It was in fairly poor condition, but he drove it around for maybe 1 or 2 years. We went to some meets in it, and then he decided it needed to be restored. So what he did is we were going to restore it in our garage. We grew up in a house on a cul-de-sac. We had a 2-car garage. And so we started in the spring. We put the car on one side of the garage, and we started taking it apart. And essentially what he would do is every morning when he would go to work, he would tell me, you know, take this off, take that off, take this off. My dad was an accountant, so his mechanical skills, although they were okay, they weren't spectacular. So I was really the person that ended up disassembling most of the car. And things went pretty smoothly for a little while until it started to get cold, fall started to come. And what happened was the garage, one half was my dad's and one half was my mom's. And of course, before that, they would park their cars inside, especially in the winter. So when it snowed and it was icy, they didn't have to scrape the snow and ice off their cars. So fall was coming and winter was coming, and my mom comes up to my dad and says, gee, you know, I don't mind you using the garage in the summertime, but, you know, winter's coming and I want to put my car back in the garage. You know, and now you guys have got the car half apart and then all the parts are on the other half and I can't get my car in the garage. And so my dad's thought was, well, what I need to do is build a workshop. So we'll have a place to work. And of course it was getting cold. We weren't going to be able to work through the winter in the garage because there was no heat. And really, if you look at picture number 1 on a table, that's a picture in the garage of me. I'm on the left, and that's a friend of mine in the neighborhood. So that was us initially tearing the car apart. So that fall, my dad staked out a area for the garage, for the workshop, I guess. He wanted to put it right next to the garage. And so he put up all these stakes, and, you know, he had a construction company come look at it and everything. And my mom was out there looking at the stakes, and she said, you know, what are all these stakes? And my dad said, well, we're going to build a workshop. And she looked around at it and she said, well, you know, I don't mind that, but he had set it up so the workshop extended back past the garage and covered up the window at the kitchen sink, which he would look out at into the backyard. And she said, no, you're not going to cover up my window. You can have the workshop, but it stops before my window. And if you kind of look at actually picture 3, that's our house there actually. And you can see the garage on the right. And the problem with our lot was on the right-hand side, he only had about 12 feet before he got into the neighbor's. There's a neighbor there now when we were doing this, not when this picture was taken, before we got into our neighbor's lot. So the front of the garage was real narrow, but then it pied out and got much bigger in the back. So his first thing was he wanted about 4 or 5 car garage workshop, and he had to pare that kind of down to 3 so my mom's window wouldn't get covered up. They ended up building the workshop that winter, which was spectacular because we had more room. It actually had heat, and we had TV, and you know, I would stay out there for hours and hours working on his car or a motorcycle or something like that. But then we ran into another problem, which was when it was time for dinner, My mom was mad because she couldn't stick her head out the window and yell, "It's dinner time," because we were out in the shop, and if it was cold, we had all the doors closed. She couldn't hear us, or we had a lot of equipment running, and she had to walk out into the shop and say, "It's dinner time. You need to come out. You need to come eat." So my dad thought, well, I got a solution for that, so he put up what he called the bell. So he put this big loud bell up in the workshop, and there was a button in the kitchen, and so when my mom rang the bell, you knew that you had 2 minutes to wash your hands and come in and sit down and eat dinner. And so that worked really well. She was really happy with that. So we got my dad's car restored. It took about 3 years, and he was driving around town. And when I was 12, he asked me what I wanted for Christmas. And I thought, you know, being a 12-year-old, I said, well, gee, I helped you restore your car for a couple years. You know, I'd like a TF of my own. So when I turn 16, I can drive around in my own TF. And I never thought that I would get anything like that. But on Christmas Day, if you look at picture number 4, that was what was sitting in our backyard. That was my car. The catch was that it was obviously all in pieces and needed to be restored. But of course, you know, I had 4 years, and I had a workshop, and I had tons of time. So it really wasn't a big deal. So I spent the next 4 years restoring my TF, which is actually sitting right here. Actually, my dad's car that we restored is the red car, which is right here too, actually. So in picture 5, there's a picture of me painting the frame outside and back behind the workshop. I did a lot of things twice, and I did some things 3 times, but it was a lot of fun. But during that time, while we were restoring my car, we were going to meets in my dad's car. And it was me, my dad, and my brother. And initially, it wasn't a problem because me and my brother, we were small enough we could both sit in the passenger seat together, and it was no big deal. Well, that worked really good kind of the first year, and then the second year as we kind of grew a little bit, the thing with the TF is there's 2 small seats, then there's a tunnel in the middle, and there's an emergency brake in the middle. And as we got bigger, we were too big to sit in the seat together, so effectively one person ended up sitting on the emergency brake, and that was extremely uncomfortable. And so there was a conflict about who was going to get the seat and who was going to get the emergency brake. And so my dad had this deal that the first person back to, you know, when we leave in the morning, the first person in the car gets to sit in the seat, and the last person in the car is going to end up on the emergency brake. Same thing at lunchtime. So that seemed to work okay for a little while until, you know, kind of after a while you'd figure out you'd stop for lunch and you'd eat real fast, and then you'd say, oh, I got to go to the bathroom, and you would run right out to the car so you could get in the seat and not have to sit on the emergency brake all afternoon. I think the third year he bought another MG so my mom could go along, so there would be 2 cars and 4 people, and no more sitting side by side. That didn't work too long. Picture number 6 is actually a picture of my car when we finished the chassis and we had the drivetrain and everything finished. Before we put the body on, we thought it'd be a great idea to drive it around and make sure that everything worked, because if there was something wrong with the transmission or the engine, it was really difficult once the body was on to fix that. Not impossible, but very difficult. So what we did, if you can see on the back, there's a bunch of sandbags on the back of the car, because without the weight of the body, the rear end was too high, and the axle or the drive shaft was rubbing on the frame. And since we lived on a cul-de-sac, I was able to just drive it around the cul-de-sac. I think in the opening video, there's a good video of me driving it around. There's also a video, I'm not sure if it's that video, that the first time I think I drove around, the bags started falling off the back. And the first one I didn't notice, and then after the second one went thump, I stopped. I maybe stopped there to put some of the bags back on, but I drove around. So my dad had been driving his car around Romeo for quite a few years, and since this was a little town, there was one little office that sold license plates and gave you your driver's license. There was one lady that ran this office, and she'd seen my dad's car, and she'd always wanted to ride and asked my dad about getting a ride. And he said, well, you know, my son's car is almost done, and when he finishes his car, you know, he'll bring it down and he'll do his driver's training test in it. And that's what we did. And actually, if you look at picture number 7, that is the lady instructor, and I don't remember her name, unfortunately. I'm sitting there in the car, looks like I'm fiddling with something. But so she got in the car and she said, okay, now I want you to drive over to my neighbor's house so they can see the car, which was about 1.5 miles from her office. So I drove over there, and her neighbors came out and looked at the car and everything. And And she said, okay, you can take me back to the office and I'll give you your license. And that's how I got my driver's license. I mean, I really knew how to drive at that point because I've been driving on some rural roads for years before that. But it's definitely a different time than it is now. So then I wanted to talk about a couple of, so I had my green TF when I was 16. I finished it. I started going to shows. It was quite a sensation because to go to MG shows, obviously most of the people there were in their mid-40s and 50s, like my dad. So for a young 16-year-old guy to have a car of his own, it was really pretty special. And one of the things that I received as a present from when I went to a meet in Ohio, it's a very nice elderly couple that came to a lot of meets, and I knew them pretty well by then because I'd been going to meets for 4, 5, 6 years with my dad. And she made me this jacket with my name on the back and obviously my car embroidered on it, and she actually made it. She was a very good seamstress. Actually, his name was Jay, and I don't remember her name, but they gave that to me soon after I finished my car. But we went to a lot of MG meets even after that. As you can see, the other jacket has a lot of the patches of some of the different shows that we went to. And there were, initially, obviously, before I was old enough, my dad always went because he had to drive. But you know, after I turned 16 and I had my own car, there were car shows that I went to that sometimes he couldn't get enough time off from work to go to. In 1977, in the MG, they had a big national meet every year. It was either on the East Coast, sometimes on the West Coast, and sometimes in the middle. And they get 200 or 300 MGT series to come to that. And one of the biggest awards to win was the distance award. And the way they figured initially when they started this, the distance was the distance you drove, not necessarily the distance that you lived away from the meet. Now you had to drive your MG to win the distance award. So, but usually, initially, it was if you lived in Detroit and the meet was in New York 1,000 miles away, then your distance was 1,000 miles. But as time went on, people would drive from Detroit to Orlando and then back up to New York to win the distance award. It became more and more difficult. When I first, was 12 or 13, we were going to the meets. If somebody drove 1,000 miles, that was a big mileage for a distance award. By the time I was 16, a lot of people were driving 2,500 miles to win the distance award. So my dad always wanted me to win the distance award. So in '77, which would have been 1 year after I finished my car, he had this scheme that I would drive from Detroit, where I live. My sister was going to college in Boston, in Wheelock College. So I'd drive to Boston. The meet was in Olympia, Washington. So I was going to drive back over to the West Coast and to Olympia, Washington. I was going to meet him somewhere in Ohio because he didn't have the time to drive from Detroit and go pick up my sister. And actually, if you look at picture number 8, that's a picture of me and my sister. Actually, my sister's driving right there, which of course she was older than me. She drove some of the trip. So that's what I did. I drove from Detroit to Boston in 1 day, 800 miles in TF. I think I left about 3 in the morning from Detroit. Yeah, it was long, but I was 17 years old. It was no big deal. So I got my sister, and then we went back across Ohio. We met up with my dad, and we spent about a week with him going across the country. He was in his red TF, and about 150 miles from Olympia, Washington, his engine blew up in his car. And so, he was kind of disappointed, way far away from home, and I think he just had the engine rebuilt recently. I continued on. I mean, my car was fine, and actually to increase the mileage, we got to Olympia, and then the next day I drove around the Olympic Peninsula, which was another 300 and some miles, and I ended up winning the award for, I think it was 4,300 miles, something like that. And that was the last year they let you do that. They had a new rule after that, which was it was wherever you lived to where the meet was, because they were like, this is out of control. But it was really a great adventure. My dad won. They also had the Hard Luck Award every year. He won the Hard Luck Award for having his car blow up 1,500 miles away from his house. But it was a lot of fun. So the next year, the meet was in Vail, Colorado, 1978, and I wanted to go. My dad wanted to go, but he was too busy. He absolutely couldn't go. He wasn't going to let us go unescorted, so he had a friend that lived in London. He lived in London, right across the Windsor, Ontario, very close to us. A guy we'd known for years, elderly guy that had a TC. So he was going to go with his wife. It was going to be me and a friend of mine, and my brother actually went with his Camaro. So I had a friend of mine named J.D. Shanahan that was a really good friend. He really wanted to go. But the problem was that we were going to be seniors coming that year, and he was the star of the cross-country track team. And the first meet was on the Monday evening after we were going to be in Vail for the show. And so he had to be back for that. His coach told him, you can't miss the first meet. If you miss the first meet, you're not going to be on the team. And he'd been on the team a few years. Again, he was one of the stars of the team, and he didn't want to miss it. So we developed this theory that, well, there's two of us, we're young, we can drive 1,200 miles from Vail back to Detroit or Romeo. We can drive nonstop, no problem. What could possibly happen? But before that, actually on the way up there, we went to Pikes Peak to drive up Pikes Peak, me and my brother in his Camaro, and we got to 10,000 feet, and he had a Z28 actually, a fairly new Z28, it was a year old, and he got to 10,000 feet and his car wouldn't run anymore. And so he and his friend rode on the back of the TC. They sat actually we opened up the boot and they sat back there, and we went up the next 4,000 feet, the four of us. Of course, none of us were very big then, but there were still four people. And we went up and back, no problem. And then he retrieved his car at 10,000 feet and went back down, which was kind of they had a thing then at the 10,000 foot point coming down, they made you stop and they checked your brakes. The guy had like a meter that showed how hot it was and everything. Of course, I was coming down in first gear, hardly using the brakes even because it had a creeper gear. And he's like, oh, your brakes aren't hardly even warm. There's four people in the car. I'm like, yeah, it's just got a real low first gear. But we had a good time that. But so JD and I's thing was that we were going to drive back nonstop. So one of the things that we decided that we would do, we figured it was 55 mile an hour speed limit back then. We figured we would average 50. The TC holds about 12 gallons and it gets about 25 miles to the gallon. So our theory was 200 miles between stops, which would be 4 hours of driving. So to make that a little easier on us, we thought we would swap every 2 hours. And then we also developed this technique that we could change drivers without ever slowing down. Now, TC has if you're not familiar, it has what is called a slow running knob. It's a knob that you screw out on the dash, which was made on cold mornings, to warm the car up at kind of a high idle, and you wouldn't have to sit in the car. But we figured out if you screwed it on level ground, all the way out, the car would go about 50 miles an hour. So you had the throttle out, and then we would just kind of slide underneath each other. One guy would hold on the wheel, slide over, hold on the wheel, another guy slide under. And we practiced that on the way out. Of course, we're on the interstate. We didn't do that in city traffic. And it worked really well. It wasn't a problem. We were able to do it. And so we left, and I'm obviously not recommending this to anybody. And we never did it in heavy traffic, because obviously the danger of that was if somebody stopped in front of you, the slow running knob was out, and besides turning the key off, you really weren't able to stop the car in any kind of safe fashion. So we took off from Vail at 3 in the morning. And the first thing was, of course, at Vail, Colorado, even in July, it's really cold at 3 o'clock in the morning up there at 10,000 feet or 12,000 feet. But I was actually going to drive the first 4 hours because it was going to be dark. We'd be coming down the mountain. JD didn't have a lot of long distance driving experience, and I had not a lot, but some. So I drove the first 4 hours, got down the mountain, became daylight. We gassed up, we switched drivers. JD started driving. And by then we're on the high plains of Colorado, we're cruising along. And so I went to sleep, and this is on the very first sleep stop for me, and I would say probably an hour into that, I don't remember, is all of a sudden I'm thinking, I feel like I'm kind of bouncing around in an airplane, and I kind of wake up and we're in the medium, and JD's asleep. And I'm like, JD, I grabbed the wheel, and good thing it was a big wide medium, we were only going 50, and he'd fallen asleep, so we got back on the road, and he's kind of, well, yeah, it's early in the morning. I'm not used to driving 2 hours at a time. So we did him 1 and me 3, and to try to make that better. And that worked pretty good until it was Sunday afternoon. We were in Kansas, I think it was, and I was asleep again. It was about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, as I remember. And I wake up, and although the car's on the road, the tachometer in a TC, which is right-hand drive, if you're the passenger, the tachometer's in front of you, but you can hear the engine. The engine's revving really fast, like 6,000 RPM, and we're not going very fast. And I woke up and I turned the key off and I said, well, JD, what's wrong? He said, I don't know, the car just doesn't seem to be going anywhere, you know, so, but I kept my foot on the gas, and I said, well, you know, something's broken, so let's not blow up the engine. So we coasted over to the side of the interstate, and we could see a gas station up there. There was an exit, we could see it. Of course, we're in a place in Kansas really flat, you see a long ways, but so it looked like a mile, which means it was probably 2.5 miles up there. And so TCs were famous for breaking the rear axles. And that's what, it didn't take long to figure out that we'd broken a rear axle, which I knew that. Of course, I always carried a spare axle with me because that was something that happened a lot. But usually you needed a press to press the new axle in, and I thought, well, we'll push the thing up to the gas station, and hopefully there'll be a mechanic shop. Hopefully they'll have a press. This is in the old days when gas stations had shops. Yeah, they had mechanics and stuff. And so we pushed it up there, and we get there, and sure enough, they had a shop. One guy around running the place, young guy, another young guy talking to him, but no mechanic there, and they didn't have a press. So we were talking to him, and I said, the one guy that was there, he said, oh, but my friend has a press, and he just lives a couple miles away. I'll go over there and see if he's around. This is before cell phones, too. And I said, great, you do that while I take it apart, and then when you get back, I can give you the new axle, and you can press the old stub out and the hub in. The other thing that happened that we were very fortunate about was, of course, the axle can break either on the outside by the hub or the inside by the differential. If it breaks inside by the differential, then you have to take the whole center section of the differential out to change the axle. If it breaks out by the hub, you just have to take the wheel off in the hub and you can pop the whole thing out. It's really pretty quick. Well, it snapped on the outside. That was really fortunate. So the guy took off, and while he's gone, I took it apart and I'm kind of fiddling around with it, and I thought, well, maybe I can drive it out with a hammer. I mean, who knows? And so I started tapping on it, and it wasn't real tight. So I was able to drive it out with a hammer, put the new axle on, and within about, 10 or 15 minutes, we were done. In fact, as we were getting finished up, we rolled it over there and filled it up with gas, and we were gone before the guy ever came back about the press, which he probably thought we left him, but that was very fortunate. So we took off, and we made it back. We actually we made it back in the 24 hours allotted. We got back about Monday morning at 3 a.m. JD got to sleep. Well, JD got a lot of sleep because I was driving 3 hours and he was driving 1, so he wasn't even really tired by the time we got home. But he did get home that night so he could go to his cross country meet. His mom was happy. He was happy about that. But it was really one fun trip. He enjoyed it. I enjoyed it. It was a lot of fun. We did a lot of other MG trips. There was a lot of other fun trips besides those two. Those were kind of the two big, huge, long trips. Again, like I said, there were times my dad was a collector of MGs, and as he started out with his red TF, then after that when we started restoring that, he bought another TF. Actually, it would be it'd be the yellow one there. He bought that, so he had a car to drive while we were restoring the first TF. And at one time, then he bought my mom a car, so she could have one. She didn't care about having a car, but that was an excuse to get another car. We had at one time, we had 6 T-Series cars and 2 M-types, which were older cars. And I know when we bought, one time, of course, garage space was always a problem. We built the workshop, which we kind of worked in and stored the cars a little bit, but when he built a pool in the backyard, of course, the pool had to have a fence around it, and that was a perfect opportunity for 3 legs of fence and 1 leg of building to hold about 20 cars, which is what we had in our backyard. So, all right, thank you very much.